All right, so we're diving into the Falls City family murders today, and it looks like we've got a lot to unpack here. News reports, crypt documents, even that 911 call from the accused.
It's one of those cases that just grabs you.
It really does.
And it won't let go.
No, it doesn't.
And for good reason. I mean, this is way more than just a whodunit. We've got
Oh, absolutely.
conflicting accounts,
Yeah.
a juvenile suspect,
Yeah.
and serious questions about the defense team's actions.
Okay, so let's just set the scene here for our listeners.
Yeah.
It was October 21st, 2024, Falls City, Washington. The victims, Mark and Sarah Humiston, and their children, Benjamin, 13, Joshua, 9, and Catherine, who was 7. Their 11-year-old daughter survived. And that's actually how this whole thing came to light.
That 11-year-old girl, she was shot,
Oh, my God.
but she played dead until she could escape to a neighbor's house and call 911.
I can't even imagine.
Her account of what happened is
I
just...
bet. Yeah, you sent over the 911 call from the accused. It is chilling. He sounds so calm, collected. He says his younger brother Benjamin was the shooter. Claims he saw him commit suicide. But there's a problem with that story.
Huge problem. The autopsy report for Benjamin shows he was shot multiple times, including a fatal shot to the back of the head.
So,
That's just not possible in a suicide.
okay, so we have a major discrepancy already between what the accused is saying and the forensic evidence. What else did investigators find at the scene? Does anything support his story?
Well, the defense is claiming there's no blood on the 15-year-old,
Okay.
implying he's innocent.
Right.
But blood spatter analysis, it's rarely that simple,
No.
you know? The absence of visible blood doesn't automatically equal innocence.
Right.
It depends on the type of weapon, the distance of the shots, even the clothing someone was wearing. There are ways to minimize blood transfer, and it's possible the crime scene was tampered with before police even arrived.
Which brings us to the defense team's actions, because they were granted unsupervised access to the crime scene
Right.
before the prosecution got there. And that's unusual.
Highly unusual,
Yeah.
especially in a case like this.
And to make things even more strange, 2 of the defense attorneys withdrew from the case shortly after that visit.
Yeah.
What could explain that?
Well, there are a few possibilities. I mean, maybe they found something at the scene that didn't match their client's story, and it created this ethical dilemma for them. Or maybe there was some disagreement about legal strategy, even pressure from the accused or his family to, maybe tamper with evidence.
You also mentioned that the prosecution is saying that the defense team tampered with evidence during that visit.
Yeah.
A missing bottle of Clorox wipes, open backpacks.
Yeah, if that's true, that's obstruction of justice.
Wow.
Plain and simple, it could mean sanctions against the defense team, and it could even impact the trial itself. It raises serious questions about what they were doing there.
So we've got conflicting narratives, questionable actions from the defense team, and forensic evidence that contradicts the accused's initial story. It seems like they're leaning towards charging the 15-year-old right.
It seems likely. But there's still a lot more to uncover. You mentioned there might be video footage from the house.
Right.
And over 1,200 photographs.
1,200 photos of the crime scene.
That's incredible. What could investigators get from all those photos?
Photos can reveal tiny details, things that might be missed during that initial walkthrough, the position of objects, signs of a struggle, even footprints or fibers that could link the accused to the crime. It's like a puzzle.
You also pointed out that some of the detectives on this case also worked the 2007 Carnation murders. That was another familicide case that really shook Washington state. Could their experience on that case be impacting their approach to this investigation?
It's something to consider, for sure,
Right.
Even though detectives are trained to remain objective, it's impossible to completely erase the emotional impact of these types of cases,
So could their previous experience lead them to make assumptions or see connections that aren't really there?
It's a valid question.
Yeah.
And one that the defense will probably bring up as the case moves forward. Okay, so this is a complicated case. We've got conflicting accounts, potentially tampered with evidence, and detectives who might be carrying some baggage from a previous case. So what happens next? Legally speaking,
Well, the big question looming over this whole thing is whether they'll try the 15-year-old as an adult.
Oh, wow.
That decision could have a massive impact on what happens to him if he's convicted, decades in prison, versus a sentence that might be reviewed after 25 years in the juvenile system.
That's a huge difference. What will the court look at when making that decision?
They'll consider the severity of the crime, the maturity level of the accused, and his potential for rehabilitation. It's a complex decision with no easy answers, and the hearing to decide isn't scheduled until June 2025.
It's so far away, especially with a case this heavy. Is there anything else in the information you reviewed that really stands out to you at this point?
One crucial detail. The surviving daughter told investigators that her 15-year-old brother was the only one who knew the combination to the gun safe.
Okay, but that seems to go against what he said on that 911 call.
Exactly. It suggests premeditation, a level of planning that wouldn't fit with a crime of passion or a sudden outburst.
Wow. It's amazing how one small detail can totally change how we see a case.
And it really makes you think about how every little piece of information, no matter how small, it can be so important in a case like this.
Yeah.
And speaking of important information, you pointed out in your notes that investigators haven't found a motive yet.
Right. The why behind it all. It's what everyone wants to know. But it doesn't seem like the investigators have any answers yet.
No, not yet. And the court documents, you sent those over too, don't offer any easy answers either. The absence of a clear motive can be incredibly perplexing for everyone.
It really is. Like
Yeah.
staring into this void, you see the devastation, the loss,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't know why. It's just
Yeah.
senseless.
Exactly. And that void, that unanswered question, it can be so unsettling, you know? It challenges our belief that even the most horrific acts have some kind of reason behind them.
It's like this case is forcing us to look at the darkness that can hide in seemingly normal lives. And it makes you wonder if there are things we don't know about yet. Details hidden just beneath the surface.
That's the question that I think is going to stay with investigators, legal experts, and the public too, until we know the truth, whatever that may be. But let's not forget about the human element here. We have a family that's been shattered, a community left reeling, and a young girl who not only survived this horrifying ordeal, but she also holds the key to figuring out what happened. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And it's a reminder of how far-reaching violent crime is. It affects so many people, families, friends, entire communities. It forces us to ask some tough questions about mental health, gun violence, and the juvenile justice system.
And we can't overlook the psychological states of everyone involved. Even the accused trauma can show up in so many different ways. And it's crucial to approach this case with empathy and objectivity.
I'm really curious about the psychological evaluations that have been done on the accused and the daughter. Their mental states could give us important insights into what led up to the murders and what's happened since.
Absolutely. They'll probably play a big role in the trial, too. They could shed some light on potential motives, the accused's mental capacity at the time of a crime, and the long-term impact of all this trauma on everyone involved.
You also mentioned the impact on the community. Fall City is pretty small. Tight-knit. A tragedy like this must have been devastating for everyone there.
It was. And the community's reaction, the grief, the support, that's an important part of understanding this case, too.
Right. It's a stark reminder that crime, especially something like this, doesn't just affect individuals. It affects entire communities. And those scars can take a long time to heal.
It also shows how resilient communities can be, coming together to support one another, seeking justice, and starting that long process of healing.
And then there's that little girl. To see something so awful at such a young age, it's
Yeah.
hard to fathom what she's going through.
Her testimony will be crucial for the prosecution. But we have to consider the emotional toll this will have on her to relive that trauma in a courtroom setting with everyone watching. It's a lot to ask of anyone, let alone a child.
It makes you think about the ethics of it all. How do we balance getting justice with protecting a child who's been through so much?
It's a tough line to walk. And it shows just how important it is to have a trauma-informed approach to the investigation and the legal proceedings. We have to make sure that finding out the truth doesn't end up hurting this little girl even more.
This is all so heavy, and the fact that we still don't know why makes it even harder. It's like this big question mark hanging over everything.
And that question mark, that uncertainty, it's tough to live with. We want to understand these things to find a reason, but sometimes there aren't any clear answers.
It's like we're hardwired for closure. But this case, at least for now, doesn't give us any.
Right. And that lack of closure, that uncertainty, it can be really hard to deal with. It can make us feel vulnerable, anxious, and question our own sense of safety.
It's a reminder that even when things feel predictable and normal, there's always the possibility of something terrible happening, something we could never have imagined.
And it's those terrible, unpredictable things that often challenge our beliefs about ourselves, our communities, and the world we live in.
You mentioned earlier that the defense is saying there could be bias in the investigation. They say that investigators can get tunnel vision, focusing on one suspect without considering other possibilities.
Yeah, it's a common tactic for defense attorneys to try to create doubt in the jury's mind, challenge the prosecution's story, and introduce the idea of reasonable doubt.
But could there be any truth to it? Could the detectives' experience with the Carnation murders be affecting their judgment?
It's possible. Even experienced detectives can have biases. Confirmation bias, for example, is the tendency to look for information that supports what we already believe.
So in this case, could they be subconsciously looking for evidence that points to the 15-year-old and ignoring or downplaying evidence that points somewhere else?
That's what the defense is going to argue. They'll want the jury to consider whether the investigation was really impartial or if it was swayed by preconceived ideas.
That's a really interesting point. It adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Yeah.
We've talked about the physical evidence, the psychological aspects, and now the potential for bias in the investigation. What else should we be thinking about as we try to untangle all of this?
Well, you mentioned in your notes the sheer amount of evidence they've collected. The 911 calls witness statements, forensic reports, the 1,200 photographs, and maybe even video footage. It's just a massive amount of information.
It's like a giant puzzle, but way more complicated.
Exactly. It shows how committed law enforcement is to documenting everything and gathering all the evidence. But it also makes the investigation that much harder.
So even with all that evidence, are there still questions that haven't been answered? Could they be missing things or misinterpreting things?
There's always that possibility, especially with a case like this. There's always the chance of human error, overlooked details, unforeseen circumstances that could change our understanding of what happened.
It makes you realize that even with the best intentions and all the technology and tools we have, we might never fully understand what happened that night in Falls City.
And that not knowing, that doubt, I think it's tough for everyone to deal with, both the people involved and the community. They just want answers.
It really is a lot to process. We've gone over the crime scene, the different stories, the psychology of the accused and the daughter. But in your notes, you also brought up the legal side of things and some potential ethical problems.
Yeah. This case is already raising some red flags. The defense team being alone at the crime scene, the accusations of tampering with evidence, and then those two attorneys leaving the case. It's just bizarre.
It really is.
Yeah.
What could happen because of all that? How could it affect the trial?
Well, the defense is saying that they needed to be at the crime scene without anyone else there to make sure their client gets a fair trial. They're saying it's crucial to being able to defend him.
But the prosecution isn't happy about it at all.
Right.
Right. They're worried about evidence being contaminated or even planted.
I see.
They're saying that the defense team might have messed up the investigation, and that could have major consequences.
So it's like two sides clashing, trying to balance the rights of the accused with protecting the investigation.
Exactly. And the judge's decision to let the defense team in there alone. Even though the prosecution and the victim's family didn't want, that's going to be a big talking point. It raises questions about how much power judges have and how far defense teams can go.
And then there's those two attorneys who quit the case. That's a big deal, isn't it?
It's definitely not something you see every day, especially in a case this big, and we don't know why they left. But it definitely adds another layer of intrigue to the whole thing.
It makes you wonder what they saw or what they found out that made them leave. Like maybe something that didn't match up with their client's story, or maybe they disagreed about how to handle the case. Yeah, those are possibilities. Or maybe they felt like the accused or his family were pressuring them to do things that weren't right.
So this case isn't just about figuring out what happened that night. It's about the ethics of the whole legal system, too.
Exactly. It reminds us that finding justice is rarely simple. It's a process with a lot of obstacles, setbacks, and twists and turns.
This has been so eye-opening. We started with that 911 call, and it seemed pretty straightforward. But now there's so many conflicting stories, possible evidence tampering, and questions about how the legal system is handling it all. It's a lot. Where do we go from here?
Well, one thing's for sure, this is far from over. The investigation is still going, the legal battles are just getting started, and the search for answers continues.
It feels like we've only just started to uncover things. Like there's so much more to this story.
I think so. But you've done a great job putting it all together. The crime scene, the different stories, the evidence, the psychology of everyone involved, and the legal side of things. It's a very thorough look at the case.
And I think we both have a better grasp of what happened. Not just with this specific tragedy, but also the bigger issues. It brings up the justice system, trauma support from the community, and trying to find the truth when faced with something so awful.
You've also highlighted how important it is to remember the people at the center of all this, the victims, the survivors, the investigators, the lawyers, and the community. Everyone is trying to cope with what happened.
It reminds us that crime, especially something this horrible, affects everyone. It touches families, communities, our whole society.
And it makes us ask tough questions about violence, justice, and what it means to be human. It pushes us to look past the headlines and try to understand these complicated issues with empathy and a desire to learn.
Well, everyone, that's our deep dive into the Falls City family murders. It's a case that's left us with more questions than answers. But it's also gotten us thinking about justice, the legal system, and the impact violence has on all of us.
As we wait to see what happens next, I hope this has given you some valuable insights and encouraged you to think critically about this case and the bigger issues surrounding it.
Thanks for joining us on this tough but important journey. And as always, keep those minds curious, keep asking questions, and stay open to new ideas.